Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, a model preservation policy for digital publishers and preservers. We are so glad that you're here with us today, and we do encourage you to use the chat function in this webinar and also the Q&A as well. A live transcript is also available. So I'm Jennifer Regala. I'm here to make some introductions of this wonderful cast that we've gathered here to get today for this presentation. And I also wanted to introduce, we don't have her here on the slide, but we're calling her our voice from the ether. Heather Staines will also be here assisting me with the Q&A box and the chat box. So again, please do freely use those, and we really look forward to some extra conversation there. So I'm Jennifer Regala. I'm the Director of Publications and Executive Editor at the American Urological Association. And I am joined today by Jeremy Morse, the Director of Publishing Technology for the Publishing Division of the University of Michigan Library. And in addition to Jeremy, we have Grant Hurley, the Digital Preservation Librarian at Scholars Portal, the information technology service provider for the Ontario Council of University Libraries. And finally, we have Corinne Gaumont. She's the Digital Scholarship Coordinator within Virginia Tech Publishing at Virginia Tech, and she focuses on new forms of research and publishing in the arts and humanities. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleagues here and get started on the webinar. And thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction. I'm Jeremy Morse. And before we get to the model policy, the reason you're all here, I'd like to take a step back and ask a big question, which is, what is digital preservation really? So it's tempting to think of digital preservation is a technology problem, and that's how it's usually talked about. It's how it's usually written about in preservation policies, to be honest. But more than anything, it's really a resource problem, and specifically a human resource problem. It takes active management, and that means that you're making a series of decisions. It's a long-term commitment, and that means those decisions are changing over time, especially in a changing technological landscape, not to mention your resources may be changing. So a policy document, if we could advance the slide, please. Thank you. A policy document can serve both to establish your organization's commitment of those resources and to document those decisions. So it's really about making your policy explicit. Many preservation policies are essentially a list of the file formats that will be used and the strategies for preserving those files, and that's all important. But it's maybe even more important, especially for publishers, to be clear about what kinds of content are being preserved in those files and what aspects of a publication you're focused on preserving. And just as importantly, what is not covered by your policy. It sets clear expectations for both your staff, your technology partners, and your readership. Next slide, please. So I like to think of preservation policy as a long answer to a short question. If I cite this piece of digital content, or share it, or bookmark it, or if I have a digitally enhanced article or monograph that I want to publish with you, then what will a future reader see when they come to use it, when they follow that citation or link, etc.? How likely is it to still be there? How likely will its appearance or functionality have changed? So in that sense, the policy is not just an internal document of organizational consensus, it's a public statement about the long-term viability of your digital publication. Next slide, please. Now, we all know the short answer to that short question, which is that a future user probably won't have the same reading experience that we have today. The technology changes, resources are finite, something about that reading experience is going to change. But if there's something we're not going to preserve, it's better if that was a conscious decision than something we wish later we had thought about. Next slide. So taking this approach, the process of writing your preservation policy should force you in a healthy way to think through the questions that are sometimes not considered. What constitutes the version of record? What aspects of a digital work are essential to understanding the scholarly argument? To what degree can the content be separated from its current presentation without negatively affecting its meaning? What will a future user need to make sense of this? We can think of this as user experience-based preservation. And the more complex, varied, and digitally native your publications are, the more complex the answers to these questions will be, and the more your own organization needs to coordinate its efforts to make this happen. So that's where you need to figure out what resources, particularly staff resources, you will have to keep preservation happening. So now to talk about how we can get there, I'll hand us over to Grant.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was a fantastic introduction to digital preservation policies. So I'm going to add a bit of context to the work that we're presenting today. Many of you may be aware that the NASIG Digital Preservation Committee conducted a survey in the long ago days of 2018. And the results of that survey emphasized that many institutions lack policies for preservation. This includes both library publishers and libraries themselves, other sorts of institutions that responded to that survey. And so a key recommendation in that survey results was to develop a model policy or template as a resource for those institutions to adopt. So, the solution was one that is very common to our field, which is to develop a working group to develop this model policy. Next slide, please. So that call went out in June 2020, and the goal was to recruit members from stakeholder organizations, including the Library Publishing Coalition and the Society for Scholarly Publishing. That call was successful, recruited a bunch of wonderful colleagues that I've met through this committee. The working group was formed in August 2020. So we've been working on developing this model policy since then. Key inspiration for us as a starting point were presentations by Heather Staines, Jeremy Morse, who's here today, and Wendy Robinson at the Library Publishing Forum in 2018. And we also reviewed a wide variety of sample policies from institutions to see, what are institutions actually doing when they create and publish preservation policies? What sort of headings and content are common to those policies? What are they, as opposed to sometimes the best practice that's discussed in the development of digital preservation policy, what are people actually doing? So we surveyed a wide variety of samples. We looked at other resources. Or the key inspiration as well is the Digital Preservation Management Workshops framework for digital preservation policies. It was developed by Nancy McGovern. And so in pulling those resources together, we started working on developing this model policy template. So next slide, please. So this template addresses high-level program functions for digital preservation at an institution. It's not specifically restricted to a library publisher, although that is one really key audience for this work. It could be implemented by any sort of institution that's interested in preserving digital assets over time, right? And the template really addresses those high-level program functions to, as Jeremy said, make decision-making consistent, repeatable, transparent over time. So here we're thinking about, does your organization have a mandate to do preservation? Is that something that you're actually involved in or not? If you're not, then maybe you stop there. Maybe you don't need a preservation policy. In line with that is, commitment to doing this sort of work over time, which involves resources, of course, and continuing resources. And then questions around scope. Again, what do we preserve? What don't we preserve? And Corinne's going to get into this in a lot more detail in a minute, as well as the goals and principles that are driving this program. And the intent here is to articulate at a high level again, what your digital preservation program is going to do, what its goals are. You may need additional repository level policies or procedures for specific collections, right? So an institution could have different collections that have somewhat more granular requirements or an access or content-based preservation requirements. And that's where you get into the more nitty-gritty around, migrating certain types of file formats, having a specific set of metadata standards at that collection level. So just as a reminder, we're still kind of talking high level here, but these things are obviously very complementary, right? In general, institutions start with these sort of high level policy frameworks, and as they develop their programs, they develop more granular documentation for specific collections. And maybe you only have this because it's sufficient, and maybe you need more depending on the type of organization. And to that point, this model policy template isn't like a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. Every institution is going to have different context, different resources available, different sorts of collections they want to preserve. And so it really is a starting point. And to that point, I'm just going to note this here right now. We're seeking feedback on this policy as well. And so we'll talk about this at the end, but this model policy, I'm sure, is far from perfect. So there's lots of time and room to make it even better. Next slide, please. So as I said, the model policy is intended as a guide and a template. Each section includes a description of the intent behind that particular section of the policy, some sample text that we've created, or guidance, depending on the type of section. In most instances, we developed essentially what is like generic sample text that is intended to apply to as wide a variety of situations as possible. That obviously needs to be customized by someone implementing it. You would, essentially take that sample text, finesse it, make it specific to your institution, delete things that don't apply, add things maybe that do. And all these things are, of course, optional, right? So this isn't a prescriptive, you must implement each section exactly as is. It has to work for your institution. So it's all here, though, to provide essentially more detailed set of resources around developing policy. It's all well and good to say, oh, well, your policy must address X, Y, and Z. But having this kind of example language can help you actually just get the ball rolling much more quickly. And as I mentioned, some sections of the policy template include guidance where sample text is difficult to make generic for all contexts. Most of the sections do have sample text, but if you, you can't reduce it to a sort of copy paste type situation. And you'll see that coming up. So I think it is time to turn it over to Corinne to talk about the actual contents of the policy template.
Thank you. That's a really nice setup for what we're about to dive into. So diving into the anatomy of what this model policy actually covers, this is a basic outline that we came up with looking at other policies, all the sample policies that we reviewed that Grant mentioned, basically covering your scope, strategies, principles, roles and responsibilities for those involved in preservation activities at your institution, administration and review of the policy itself, any collaboration that might be happening, related documents, and the glossary. And we'll dive into each of these sections now. Next slide, please. So starting with, there are first two sections that kind of introduce the policy. This is really meant to set it up for users to be able to use this as a model. So the executive summary describes what the policy is for, the goals for the model policy, and who developed it, us, and why we developed it. So basically everything Grant just discussed. And then the how to use this document. This is a really short document or really short section, really going over how can you implement this policy or model policy at your institution or perhaps in your publishing program. It covers the sample text, the section guide, and the sources from other preservation policies. Next slide, please. Then getting into kind of the meat of the actual model policy, what we're suggesting is starting with the introduction. So the introduction is mostly logistical things, and that includes things like the date the policy was originally created, maybe any dates of updates that you've made to the policy since then. It also might be a general description of your organization, any digital resources that are covered by the policy, the institutional units responsible for the policy and for the preservation activities that the policy is covering, resources that are required, and that includes both the technology resources as well as time, even attention, and anything like that. The organization's commitment to authors and stakeholders, if that's of consideration. And then also, why are you preserving content? That's kind of a big question, but that's a good thing to cover within this introduction. Next slide, please. So the scope, this is really the, I think Jeremy said it earlier with what's important to know, like it's important for publishers to know what they're preserving. So this is where you get into the scope of things. What materials are you preserving? This might be stuff that the users are accessing directly, maybe the actual journal articles or actual book, ebooks. And it might also be materials that are meant specifically for the stakeholders like the authors or peer reviewers. So are you preserving any peer review content, any comments or annotations, any ancillary content like data sets? So here are some kind of general examples of things that you might consider including in this section. And this is all in the sample in the model policy as well. But any institutional collections, the text itself, any embedded assets, images, videos, audio, since if we're talking digital publications, those things can be embedded. The metadata that goes along with the publications themselves, that could include the descriptive metadata as well as the technical metadata. Other annotations or comments, the peer review notes, like I mentioned, and any previous versions of an article. If there was a preprint published in a repository, do you want to preserve that as well? Externally hosted supplementary content like the data sets that I mentioned, and there's a lot more to consider. So a lot of those are listed within the model policy. Next slide, please. So the next section will be the strategies. This will really get into how are you going to actually preserve the content you're preserving. So what procedures, tools, and techniques are needed to implement the policy. These might include things like refreshing or the digital archaeology or forensics that you might need to do with files, any bit level preservation, any emulation or migration of content or platforms. Next slide, please. The principles, this is kind of getting into what are the principles of your preservation model. Any concepts or functions that guide your program or activities. This might include any adherence to standards you follow. It could also appear as a single block of text where you can start breaking it down into different things. The foundational principles that might be more of your values versus the operational principles that are much more functional principles. So a couple examples of the foundational principles would be things like compliance with any existing policies and procedures that either you might have or that are recommended by any standards that you're following, or perhaps the purpose of digital preservation activities of your program, kind of what's the value of your digital preservation activity. And then examples of some more operational principles might be defining responsibilities, maintaining any resources or documentation that you've created. Other things that you could include are things like staff time, training for staff, creating the documentation, all of that. So making sure that you also have the skeleton available to actually follow through with this policy. Next slide, please. Roles and responsibilities, this kind of gets more into specific individuals or groups. And by individuals, we don't mean like, hey, name this person directly, but more so like what position might cover these things. So details of positions and groups involved in implementing your preservation policy, these will definitely vary greatly depending on your institution and your program. As a larger institution might have more variety of people, a smaller institution may have less variety, but the same key people might still be there. So thinking about who at your institution would be responsible here. You can also split these into like decision makers and the people actually carrying out the work. So you might have a committee that's helping make the decisions of this is how things should go, but they're not actually doing the actual preservation activities versus the people who are carrying out the work. So some examples of people who might be included in either of those categories are folks in IT support, any preservation experts you might have either at your library or within your larger institution, any repository managers. I know we have an institutional repository, so that would be somebody to include, and maybe people on your publishing team. And again, these can be people within your program or your institution. You might also look at any other groups that you're working with outside of your institution. If you're working with somebody like clocks or blocks, those might be good groups to consider as well. Next slide, please. The framework and administration and review cycle and the collaboration sections are both really short sections, but it's really getting at covering the logistical things of your policy again. So the framework and framework administration and review cycle kind of covers the details about creating and maintaining your policy. It should be short and straightforward, just maybe a paragraph or two that just says, this is how often we review this policy. This is how often we check to make sure that we're adhering to it, or perhaps reviewing it to see why we're not adhering to it. And then the collaboration section is really just a statement to cooperate and collaborate within your organization and other like organizations. So all those people that we mentioned under roles and responsibility, or those groups that we mentioned that you might work with, this would just be like a statement to just really nail down that, yes, we are collaborating on this work together. Next slide, please. And then there's another section, fairly short, the related document section. This is any other institutional documents related to your policy. So if this is specifically a policy for your publishing program, but you want to make sure that you link to your repository preservation policy, that might be a good document to include. Other examples include if your institution has a disaster plan, any records management policy, sensitive data policy, anything like that. Things that helped influence the decisions you made while creating your own preservation policy. And then finally, we have a glossary, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's the concise explanations and definitions of key concepts that are preservation and or institution specific. So these can be things that are very preservation jargony that other folks reading this policy might not know. And it could also be acronyms from your own specific institution. I know personally we have a ton of acronyms here that probably could be defined, especially for new folks coming in. Next slide, please. And I believe I'm going to hand it back to Jennifer here. Oh, Jennifer, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I think I'd understand Zoom by now. So how can you read this this document? We are sharing the link here, and also what we're really encouraging is feedback from every one of you. I notice here, this is a really important note, sorry for looking at a side screen, but Heather in the chat, Heather from the Ether, we introduced her as, she pointed out that the people who are tasked with working on the policy might have an uneven awareness or limited experience. And even within this group, that was true of folks who put this document together. I will out myself as the person who did not have a lot of experience with it, but it was a really useful exercise for me to participate and say, what are you guys talking about here? And what are you guys talking about there? And I think that's really important to consider when moving forward with your own policies. And I know that will help to drive me within my own organization. But I just wanted to see too, if we could answer some questions possibly. I have a question from Celia asking, is this model policy designed for publishers and preservers who don't pay for outsourcing preservation to a company such as Clocks or Portico? Didn't know if one of you might want to take that question.
I'll jump in. Yes, I mean it's designed for flexibility, and I think there'll be a lot of cases where you have a layered approach to digital preservation, where some content or some aspects of a publication would be preserved in Clocks or Locks. You might also do deposits in Portico. You might have in-house publication. You might be housed within a larger institution, which does some measure of digital preservation as part of its policy. And so if you're thinking about like the different aspects of a publication or different types of publication, if you do journals and monographs, the answers might be a bit different. So, you know, I think like sort of tool, but thinking about like for this type of publication, we use something else. It definitely should be considered.
Absolutely. And I'd just add that the section on roles and responsibilities is probably a key area for noting that you are working with those outside people, and that they are key stakeholders in any preservation decisions that you're making within your organization.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly it. Just I'll add in my 2 cents as well, which is that, Clocks and Portico or other third-party service providers should have their own policies, right? Their own preservation policies, so that they can prove to you as an organization that they're doing what they say they can. And in the case of those 2 organizations, they've been audited by the CRL track group. Others may not have been, and that's not necessarily a requirement to work with a third-party provider, but they should be able to tell you, what it is that they're doing to preserve materials on your behalf.
Here's another very interesting question. Is there a component on, now I'm lost it because now we're getting a bunch of questions. Hold on. Is there a component on best practices for tracking copyright as metadata, as policy, longevity plans?
It's an interesting question. I also maybe speak a little bit to it. When it comes to the field of digital preservation, there is a metadata standard called PREMIS, PREMIS, which includes a rights module that allows you to track rights information about digital objects, like individual files. And so right now, actually, at my job at Scholars Portal, which is a preservation service provider, looking at implementing PREMIS to track that kind of rights information, but specifically for preservation rights rather than copyright specifically, although the PREMIS standard does have a really rich set of fields that you can use in order to track copyright. There may be other approaches that other people take, though, so I'd be interested to hear that as well.
Yeah, I would say Corin and Grant and Jennifer will correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think it's explicitly addressed in the model policy, but I don't think that's an oversight, because it doesn't, the preservation policy isn't addressing your acquisitions policy, your editorial policy, and that's where I think your copyright policies would be centered. Is that be like a layer before the preservation? So preservation policy assumes you've already made a decision to preserve it in one way or another, or to do something with it, and now you have to preserve it. So I do think, like, if you're thinking about library publishing or publishing, there's a service layer above the preservation layer that I think would address rights issues, that would be a separate but related policy. And maybe in version 2.0 of the model policy, we could hint at that more strongly, which might be a segue to another question.
So is there a recommendation to review the policies every so often? And I think that's what we're saying too. There's a recommendation that that this group should review this document itself. I mean, I definitely think that's an important, consideration in internal policies for sure. Not just saying, okay, that box is checked and now we're going to be complacent and just sit back. Jeremy did point out at the beginning of this presentation that things are constantly changing. Like, who knows how anyone will be reading any of this in 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and even further down the road. So to me, that's, a very important consideration, thinking of it as a living and breathing document.
Or
Yeah.
so go ahead, Corinne.
Oh, sorry. I was going to add to that the framework and administration section at the end, it's a fairly short section, but that does explicitly, in the sample language we provide, does explicitly say, like, how often will you review this document? And I just checked it. We did not provide like an example of number of years, but I'd say that's something to look at, perhaps with other policies within your organization. Does your organization have kind of like a set standard for how often you review other policies, and should that be applied to this one? Mm-hmm. Sorry, great, go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You set it up nicely. Like I also checked, it's like, hey, we don't specifically say how often you should review this policy, since organizations may be different, but having surveyed a lot of these, most organizations review these every 2 to 3 years. Sometimes they'll like convene a committee or something like that to do that. The idea being that, this isn't a document that needs frequent refreshing, whereas, very procedural documents might require like constant updating, whereas this is something you might come back to every once in a while and make sure, okay, it's still working for us, basically.
May I ask a question? So I think I have the advantage again of having the privilege of having worked with you all, who I will say again, it's been great just working with such experts in this area. But I think if I were coming to this webinar today without having met with you all and spent all of this time with you and reading through the document really mindfully, I would see the need to do this, but I would be a little bit daunted by the thought of where to start. So can you give me any practical suggestions if I were just, coming to this webinar today, fresh off the street, where should I start with my organization and how should I start the process to move forward?
Well, so, a very important part of the equation here is getting institutional commitment. So, and I think that starts with your administration. So that's the kind of the place we found ourselves in at my home institution. I'm not selling tales out of school, is that we had been doing it as a matter of like de facto policy, but not explicit policy. And so things that we had set up in original digital preservation efforts were still going strong, but we had added all this other stuff we were doing that really wasn't being addressed by the original practice, and there wasn't a defined policy that said what that practice was really, or how we expanded it to cover the new types of activity we were doing. So, it's really like it has to be like a strategic objective of your organization, that you're going to commit resources to making this work. And then somebody has to be responsible, that framework administration review cycle, somebody has to take ownership of the policy and the review of it. So I think that's step one, is, having a steering committee or something that owns the process.
Mm-hmm.
It's very funny, oddly, like coincidentally, a librarian at a university here in Canada reached out to me this week asking for advice on preservation policy development. And she was kind of like, why is there suddenly all this movement around this topic? Like I see people talking about it and wanting to find resources about the subject. And she wondered if there'd been some sort of, new standard that institutions were supposed to meet around this. And the answer, of course, is no. Like there hasn't been like at least in Canada, like a dictate from the government that says you must develop a preservation policy. Not yet anyway, but I would love that. And so, I think the need has to come from, it's coming from somewhere. And I think a lot of the time it's from our stakeholder communities too, who are expressing interest in knowing what our institutions are actually doing to maintain access to these materials of many types, right? Published materials, could be born digital archival materials over time, right? And increasingly, donors to institutions, other stakeholders are looking for evidence of preservation programs. And so hopefully that provides enough sort of justification to an administration to actually start taking this work seriously.
I'd also add that part of the reason I joined this group was because I wanted our publishing program to have a preservation policy, and I had no idea where to start. So I was looking at other preservation policy. I looked at some of the ones from University of Michigan, several others, and I had seen like a variety of things that started from like a paragraph or two to full-blown policies, like the one that we're suggesting. So I think this model preservation policy is a really helpful tool. And I'm gonna try and test it out and see if I can create something with it. And I guess that will be the real test. But I think, yeah, having just some examples to look at, and even the sources sections, the sources kind of subsections within the sections of the policy that link to some example policies that we reviewed are really helpful places to start.
So here's another question. Does the collaboration part of the document address cooperation with other institutions? That work can be shared rather than duplicated? That's a great question.
I think I'll try and tackle this one and say, yes, it absolutely can. This, like we've said, this is a flexible document. So if a key part of your preservation activities are collaborating with other institutions or cooperating with other institutions, that should definitely be written in possibly that section, if not others as well. I don't know how others feel about that.
That's exactly it. Like, I think one of the reasons why this isn't a freestanding section within this model policy is that it's commonly said that digital preservation work isn't done alone, right? You rely on lots of layers of people, organizations, technology. And so pulling that out and identifying those places where you are working with others, for one content area or another, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, is important to kind of document, right?
To follow up on that question, that's a really good point. Which section specifically? That's a question from Celia.
It's the section labeled collaboration. Yeah, kind of near the end.
Yeah, I think it's sandwiched between, looking at my notes, right between the framework and the related document section.
And then are you able to talk, can we talk a little bit about the upcoming timeline for this review?
That's reviewing the feedback we get back on the draft policy. I'll go ahead and talk, even though I don't know if I have the answer prepared. I think we said through November. What did the email say? I want to say November 20th. The date in my head, but I have to look that up. Don't hold me to that.
I'm gonna double check that right now, but I think you're right.
See, unmute yourself and start talking and get yourself into trouble.
November 30th, 10 extra days.
Just think of it as a 20th, and then you have time to be late.
Right, so lots of comments. So there's one of two ways to submit feedback. One is through the SurveyMonkey link that was posted in the chat a little while earlier, posted again, as well as commenting on the Google Doc itself. So if you have specific comments about one part of the policy or another, that's an easy way to put those in. Heather also asked, okay, so you can get feedback in by November 30th. What happens after that? Well, we'll think about it. Collate that feedback, probably run through another version of the model policy, incorporating all of that. And then I believe the goal for like sort of the formal release is next spring, like spring 2022, but someone could correct me if I'm wrong.
I believe that's what was discussed a couple weeks ago.
Cool. There's an earlier question from Amy as well about recommendations for institutions that may already have an existing policy that they would like to upgrade using this framework, which sounds like a great idea to me. I think it would be a great test of this framework too, if you have something in place that you've had for a while, maybe haven't thought about it, to see, like, compare the two and see, what may be missing from one or the other, right? There may be good parts about your existing policy that are missing from this, draft model. So you can let us know. I think that would be really helpful. Any other thoughts from the group on that one?
I think it'd be a really interesting kind of mapping exercise to see where things from an existing policy fit into this framework. Like you said, to also figure out maybe what we're missing, or what if your old policy is missing. And there might be things that don't line up exactly. And again, that's okay. This is a flexible document.
It's also a good opportunity to make sure all of your stakeholders have been in on that conversation of preservation policy, especially like if you're a library publisher. Have you talked to the archives? Have you talked to special collections? Make sure that all the areas of institution that could be impacted or benefit from a preservation policy are at the table.
That's right. And to the point, like if you have an existing policy, you sort of have to look at it and think, okay, what level is this addressing? Is it really granular, step-by-step information about a particular content area, or is it specific to, the archives maybe, because they went ahead and developed something that worked for them? Or is it addressing that high level of the organization, sort of giving that bird's eye view of all the activities going on? So figuring out sort of where it fits in the stack of policies that you could have at one point in a beautiful future where everything is perfectly documented.
It'd be kind of interesting to take one of those higher level policies and then kind of like narrow it down to a specific department, to see what maybe your specific department or unit can do to better fit what that higher level policy goals are.
We should find those folks willing to do that and have a follow-up webinar, like a key.
Yeah, like actually implementing it, that'd be great.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. I always like to hear that, like the real nuts and bolts, how someone actually did it. That would be helpful. Here's a question, and I don't mind starting off with an answer for this. Is there anything specific for publishers to consider? Like, for example, peer review. And yes, in my opinion, yes, there's a lot for us as publishers to consider, especially to so peer review. I think that's often in the many editorial offices that I've seen. Of course, the records go back as far as that relationship with the peer review vendor, the software vendor goes. And then it's just kind of piecemeal. If, older legacy software that's no longer being used is that being archived, but how is that being done? And I think this is a really important consideration. And I have to say, every time I meet with this group, my heart starts beating a little bit more quickly. I've been with this organization for a year and have absolutely been, thinking about these things and how to actually implement. Peer review is a perfect example, though. I mean, there are things that come up for multiple different reasons and from many years in the past, and you never really know what those things might be or why they're coming up, but often it's for an important reason, whether it's like an investigation, for instance, of an important piece of work that has been the foundation for other important work, but there's some sort of reason to doubt its integrity, as an example. So, how do we access that? Again, I think this is something that really every publisher needs to be thinking about carefully, but I think the challenge comes in that, often societies and associations with publishing programs are on the smaller side, and it's a resource thing. And that's why it ties back to my question earlier. Okay, hi, I'm here at the webinar, but what do I do now? Help, I need to get started. And I do think that's a really important point of understanding oneself, the urgency, if you will, behind, wanting to do this and the need for wanting to do this, and then explaining that coherently to leadership to get that support and those resources to help with that. So it's an excellent question and something important to consider. I'm not seeing any more questions. I'm looking at all my screens. Oh, Heather from the Ether has a face.
Heather is now from the Ether. I just wanted to jump in for folks who were at the NASIG annual meeting. Amy Carlson, who's on the who helped us put this webinar together today, amongst with other people as well. But Amy presented in a session that looked at preservation of unique collections at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and the step-by-step process that they went through to figure out where things might already being preserved and who else was preserving them. And so I would say, if you have access to that, go back and take a look, because it's a great case study for how to get started. So.
Great comment in the chat too. Please, I do encourage everyone to scroll back through the chat. There's a lot in there, a lot of definitely the SurveyMonkey link, but a note here from Elizabeth Ann Johnson about a great resource for free and low-cost digital preservation tools as well.
Kind of related to that too, something that I realized when I was re-reviewing the policy this week was kind of in that principle section, there is this principle of, do you want to use open source preservation tools? And so thinking about like what tools you're using and why within that principle section, this looks like a great resource that Elizabeth shared, but I think that's just another side point that I had forgotten that we discussed within the last year. That was a really good reminder to me.
Yeah, to Heather's point earlier, and as I'm interested in hearing the presentation that you mentioned as well, like often I'll, as sort of a first step really for institutions who are thinking about doing this work, just doing an inventory of the materials that are of value to you, figuring out what you have in your collections that you actually would cry if you lost. Putting that out in a spreadsheet and figuring out, okay, like, you know, what do we prioritize for preservation is a great first step. It also just helps you establish whether you actually want to be doing this work or not, or whether you want to, if you are actually already covered by a third-party, service provider, or want to enter into a relationship with a third-party service provider of some kind, want to develop in-house capacity with those open source tools. Like, all those decisions have to be informed by the materials that you are seeking to preserve. And so a lot of institutions haven't really even started just sitting down and thinking about the digital collections, whether those are library materials, materials within the archives and special collections units or some other place, right? Sort of mapping it all out. It can be a long process, but it seems, to me anyway, it seems like a valuable place to start.
And helps you prioritize if resources are limited, or you're just ramping up and you got to start somewhere. Like, what's most critical to preserve and make sure you're starting there.
On behalf of the Digital Preservation Committee, which is very thrilled to have this group associated with us, I just want to say that we will be making the recording of this webinar available along with the document, along with the SurveyMonkey link. And so our objective is to get as much feedback as we can for consideration. And then we may actually be sending some special invitations for folks to participate if we think you have a particular skill, and there might be a section of the document that maybe folks have not yet gravitated to yet. And so look for some updates and maybe special requests or calls for help, as the months go by. And our objective is to get everything nicely included and in time to have this policy be available for the 2022 annual meetings. Let everyone know. Tell all your friends. I'm just going to call it seems like a wrap, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Any word from anything from NASIG in closing, anything that you need to promote before we sign off? All right. Anything and everything NASIG, go check it out. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.
Thank you.